Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you to my esteemed panelists. I think that this discussion is such an important one because there's been so much concern about geofragmentation and what that means in terms of reshaping the business environment in which we operate. And it is clear, I mean, we all know that it does appear that there is a new world order right now that is taking place. And it's not just an economic world order, it's also political, because you look in Europe and you see a dramatic rise in the number of populist governments who are much more focused on national interests. So when you look at the changes that we're seeing politically, economically, technologically, all these changes afoot, I think the big question that I have for all of my panelists is how do we all position ourselves in terms of the way in which we meet these challenges over the next 5 or 10 years. And Nir, let me bring you into the conversation because there is still so much concern about volatility, about uncertainty. And if you're thinking about the changes that we're seeing from the perspective of an investor, how do you even begin to make sense of it? How do you even begin to process it?
So first of all, it's incredible to be here, and beautifully said by both Princess Reema and Richard earlier. And just to build on something Richard said, he kind of opened and said, the world is shifting fast. We believe that's exceptionally true, meaning the world is changing in very significant ways, very, very fast, and that's going to matter to everybody, and it's especially going to matter to investors. And just to lay that out in kind of 3 big shifts. So one, the macroeconomic paradigm that we've been living for the last 3 decades has changed. We've had massive tailwinds from globalization, expanding profit margins that benefited from disinflation, lots of gains all over the world. But those gains were distributed very unequally. They led to the rise of China, but they also led to the hollowing out of the manufacturing base and the middle class in the US and the Western world. And you let that play out, and you see political changes started to happen. You heard President Trump talk about his desire to fix this yesterday. In addition to that, while we benefited from global supply chains that led to efficiencies, they also led us to be codependent. And you remember in COVID where we were trying to get basic things and we couldn't get them? And then with the Russia-Ukraine war that will hopefully end soon, we've learned that those codependencies can be weaponized also. You take the rise of China, you take the hollowing out of the middle class and the manufacturing base in the US and the political shift that followed. You take the realization of the codependencies, and you have a macroeconomic paradigm that has shifted 180. From globalization, we're now at what Bridgewater calls modern mercantilism, which is a macroeconomic environment where governments are actively trying to avoid the vulnerabilities of globalization. They're trying to avoid trade deficits. This is where protectionism and localization of manufacturing is kind of coming from. So that's one big change that any investor has to realize. We are going into a very different environment than the one that we came in from. The other 2 quick big shifts that are happening that are important to process is that during this time, the other thing that has already happened is portfolios, while wealth got a lot more distributed, Asia, Middle East, emerging markets, portfolios got a lot more concentrated, actually. So institutional investors have doubled their allocation to illiquids, as an example. And even within the liquid portion of their portfolios, it's never been more concentrated. 70 cents of every dollar went to US equities. And US equities are driven by very few firms. So going into this massive change of macroeconomic paradigm, you have portfolios that are very vulnerable. And the last thing I'll say, as if that's not enough, is we're in the midst of once in multiple generation technological disruption. It's already here. The intelligence is already here. AI models that failed in the Math Olympics, got a score of 0 18 months ago, are going to get a gold medal this year, exceeding any human. And the CapEx that's been invested last year is going to double, and the question of what's going to happen to productivity, employment, and social implications is right in front of us. You take those 3 things, and that uncertainty requires investors to really pause and think how they understand this well and position themselves well for this future.
The nature of people is to prosper. That is absolutely correct, Nir. And one of the one thing that some people might say is a big hindrance to prosperity is possibly rising global debt, Nir. And just talk to us a bit more about what that means in terms of financial stability, especially when you think about the fact that there has been a rise in populist governments in Europe, and a lot of people associate populism with possibly raising the deficit in their countries.
So let me just start by apologizing because I feel like I'm the depressor here in the panel. Princess Reema brings the hope, Gianni brings the fun, and then I come in to kind of bring it all down. Let's talk about debt. So I agree. First of all, the problem is there. The president talked about it yesterday. Meaning we have if you take the U.S. as an example, public debt is at levels that are only comparable to wartime, and that is happening while the economy is prosperous. And to your point, I would step back and kind of think about the stability of the system, the medium and long-term stability of the system. And there's basic ingredients for that stability. So to your point, one important ingredient to that stability is that your income growth matches your debt growth, right? The second ingredient to that stability is that your spending growth is equal to your productivity growth. The third one is to look at the returns on assets and to make sure that the returns are reflected in the price and the risk premiums. If you just take those three things, all three of them are under strain. So to your point on debt, the US deficit, as an example, is growing much faster than the revenues the government has. The president yesterday was very clear about his intention to go and tackle that problem. There is a difference this time around because this is public debt versus private debt. In other cycles, it was the private sector that got overly indebted, but the basic mechanics are the same. You have to be able to make enough money to cover your debts, and if you're not, at some point, the system is going to collapse. Same is true about spending versus productivity. We're still spending faster than our productivity is growing, and if you just want to kind of see the biggest signal to that is inflation is still above target, and I talked earlier about modern mercantilism and how that's going to make a less efficient world. That's going to be further inflationary pressures that's going to throw that further out of equilibrium. And there's a question whether AI will come in, increase productivity, and rebalance that. And then lastly, on asset prices, we talked about how all assets are concentrated in the US. The US assets are priced to perfection. There is no risk premium at all. So you got to look not just at the debt, but at all these indicators of health and say, medium to long term, we have to have some policy that's going to make the situation more sustainable.
It's not just about nations positioning themselves, it's also about companies and leaders navigating these times and ensuring that trust exists between themselves and their employees during this time of volatility and uncertainty. Nir, give us a bit more about how Bridgewater specifically is positioning itself during this time.
So, I mean, let me hit that at two levels and also build on the beautiful things Princess Reema just said. So, going into an uncertain environment like the one that I described, Bridgewater and macro investors like Bridgewater must shine. This is when our partners need us more than ever. Our partners in the Middle East, our partners in Asia, our partners in the US. And that means if you kind of take the three things I said in the beginning, this is a time where the tailwind is over. Alpha generation is more important than ever. Uncorrelated return streams is more important than ever. A deep understanding of how the world works. What are going to be the cause-effect linkages and how that's going to flow through into the economy that my peers talked about here. That's a major role we're focused on. That's one. Two, into these concentrated portfolios that we've talked about. We're celebrating our 50th year this year. By the way, 20 years in the kingdom, 30 years in the Middle East. It's always been a journey of partnering with the largest pools of capital, thinking hard about how to create resiliency and diversification in their portfolios. And specifically, I'll just give two really fast examples, working with the most sophisticated pools of capital to put together what we call risk management plans. These are return streams that are supposed to do well when the rest of their portfolio does poorly. Think about the environment we're going into and how important that is. Another example is knowing to invest not just in the US. So our in China, as an example, last year returned over 30%, and we've had an average 20% year over year. This is where regions like the Middle East, I think, are going to play such an important role given the importance of geographic diversification. The last thing is on the tech evolution. We've always leaned into technology because no one can try to understand how the world works just by using their brain. It's always been using the best humans and the best technology. It led us to have the deepest body of macro IP in the world. That is, being a practitioner is the way to understand how this is going to impact the world, and then we can share that with our clients for them to manage their circumstances.